Right now, I'm thrilled to begin to welcome to the stage to open the second day of the Hannah Arendt Center conference, Leon Botstein, the president of Bard College, and someone who has been a friend of Hannah Arendt's, a supporter of the center, and always loved to hear his opening remarks at the conference every year. So please welcome Leon Botstein.
So I want to welcome all of you and thank you all for coming. I do also want to thank Roger and the staff of the Hannah Arendt Center for putting on these conferences, which have over the years been terrific and, when appropriate, controversial, which is great. And it would have it's always hard to speculate about dead people, so I'm not going to do that, but just briefly that I think it would have delighted Hannah Arendt, and it certainly, the activities of the center and the publications and this thing I see every Sunday, this Amor Mundi, you know, I get so much of this mail, but it's actually readable and absolutely interesting, and so I look forward to it, and I think Roger and his colleagues have done a terrific job, and we look forward to many more years of activity and conferences. So on behalf of the college, the dean yesterday welcomed everyone, and I'm doing the same. I can't resist making some offhand comments on the subject, as I understand it, of this conference. So I'm not an expert, so I provide you my apologies ahead of time. And in this case, I'm a little baffled because I'm not sure I understand the words that are involved. So that allows me to think freely because I try to figure out what is this really all about. So I'm going to start with the word cosmopolitanism, which is the Greek and the English usage. So when I was thinking about Hannah Arendt, I thought about imagining her conception of this idea of the cosmopolitan, which is not in the English language, but in the German language, the word Weltbürger, world citizen, you might say. That's the way it translates. And it's a very particular concept in German thought in the 19th century and 18th century. And a couple of years after she was born, a very famous book was written by the German historian Friedrich Meinecke called Weltbürgertum und Nationalstaat. So it was a study of the idea of the cosmopolitan, a cosmopolitan society, and the nation state. A very influential book. Meinecke trained generations of German historians. But the actual use of the word Weltbürger really comes about in the German language in the 18th century. So you find it in Wieland, in Schiller, in Goethe, and even in Herder. And it describes a person whose loyalty is universal and rational, based on the assumption of the civic or moral or ethical quality of all human beings. And it's contrasted with patriotism, interestingly, and also sometimes contrasted with a more primitive idea of what a nation or Vaterland might be. It's distinctly urban, but it's also distinctly detached from the practical circumstances of existence, place, family. And it has a kind of attractive theoretical character. In 1953, the German press reported on an incident that took place outside of Buckingham Palace, in which an American, 31-year-old American, publicly demonstrated to give up his American citizenship in order to become a cosmopolitan. The way it was reported in the German press was he wanted to become a Weltbürger. And in the 19th century, beginning with a very famous but overlooked German political critic, Wilhelm Riehl, the idea of being a cosmopolitan shifted from its essentially attractive 18th century roots in Weimar classicism. It became a negative, the idea that it was something that was detached from the real life of people. And that criticism bled into the most famous sociological distinction that many of you know between community and society. For Ferdinand Tönnies, the idea of Gemeinschaft, which is the community, and Gesellschaft, which is the society. But from Hannah Arendt's point of view, as I read her, not that that's entirely relevant, she had a very ambivalent relationship to the idea of being a cosmopolitan. The most famous text in which she goes slightly off the rails is her review of Stefan Zweig's autobiography, The World of Yesterday, where she excoriates him for imagining a world that is completely theoretical and doesn't exist, in which this theoretical world, international world of cosmopolitan people. And the sort of criticism of it as being a kind of self-imposed snobbery and unattractive, that what's important about it is that it posits, in Arendt's point of view, in a positive way, the idea that the political organization, the character of law, constitutionalism, politics, especially as she comes to America, that the idea of the cosmopolitan is compatible with the idea that you can acquire citizenship, you're not born into it, that it's a status which can be rationally acquired, rationally lost, say to treason or something like that, and that it in principle, the idea of citizenship doesn't carry with it privilege or priority. But there's something hollow about that identity, something hollow about it, and she recognizes that. Now, I understand, just as a reader, the idea of the cosmopolitan and its varying shapes. It's negative. It ultimately becomes associated with the Jews of Central Europe within a community that's defined differently, and that it becomes, therefore, an instrument of criticism and racial distinction, and has to do, obviously, with learning and cultivation and aesthetic taste and judgment. So it's a kind of sense of superiority. Hard to think about being an illiterate cosmopolitan. Seems not a possible idea. Let me turn for a moment as an outsider to the question of tribalism. This is not a word I understand. I don't understand the word. I don't understand the word tribe, and I don't understand the word tribalism. I just don't understand what it means. So I began to think, well, how can you think about it? Well, In the American context, because of the way we tell the story of the indigenous population of the United States, we are familiar with it. In the German language, I'm thinking about Arendt again, just as an exercise. Probably the most logical word is the word Stamm. And where would she have come across the idea of tribes? Well, there's the Roman source, there's Tacitus, there is the discussion of the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes, the word Sippe, clan, is a more compelling usage, and that a clan you can join by taking an oath. Actually, you don't have to be, you're not necessarily born into a clan, you can join it, which is a very important distinction. So, the other source, of course, are the 12 tribes of Israel, is the biblical source, which she was fully familiar with. And that is the most common usage in the 18th century and 19th century of the idea of Stamm, the 12 and the 10 lost tribes. And what it suggests, the word also means trunk. It has a biological characterization, has a multiple use. It's a very tricky word, which tribe isn't in English. Tribe doesn't describe a natural phenomenon. Stamm is a biological origin word, trunk of a tree. And so the interesting about this idea of Stamm is that it also has a religious quality because it was also the way the cross on which Christ was crucified was talked about. And again, Jasper's teacher, Max Weber, famously wrote a book on the religion of ancient society of ancient Israel, in which he made the distinction that Judaism is a tribal religion, not a universal religion, unlike Islam and unlike Christianity. So of the Abrahamic religions, it is a tribal religion without aspiration to universal status. Membership in it cannot easily be acquired. It can be acquired, but it's extremely difficult. And it's not necessarily lasting. In contrast to baptism, for example, which some people argue is indelible. So I began to think, well, what's the significance of this? The tribe depends on the claim of descent from a single origin. So it fits absolutely neatly with the story of Abraham and his descendants. The covenant is a tribal pact between a God whose loyalty is only to a single tribe, which then divides into many tribes. Conveniently, 10 of them are lost. But nonetheless, that is the idea of the religious community. Whereas the cosmopolitan clearly relies on a secular idea of how politics should be organized. And my suggestion is that what's different about the cosmopolitan, what that means, is that it permits a politics which doesn't require a religion. It also doesn't require a biological justification for membership, whereas being a member of a tribe does. In the German usage, it becomes the kernel of a later pseudoscientific theories of racism. And transfers from the issue of inheritance to blood purity. And that's its transformation in 19th century German racist thought. So for those of you who know this very fantastic book that was published about 10 years ago, which is a book called Eichmann Before Jerusalem. This is the major work done to show that Arendt got the character of Adolf Eichmann wrong. In other words, she had the right theory, but the wrong guy. That he actually is the Argentine papers, which came out, those called Stassen papers, showed that he was a fanatic. And in the emigre community in Argentina, he hung out with a lot of other ex-Nazis, and among them, he was the most ideological fanatical. He believed in the purity of the Aryan race. He believed in the impurity and poisonous character of Jews. And he hoped, after the debacle in 1956, which the invasion by the Israelis, the French, and the English, and the Suez Canal was stopped, that circle of Nazi emigres believed that the Arab population would pick up and finish the job that they had failed to do, which is to exterminate the Jewish people. Now, the way they got around this theoretically that was justifiable is a theory of race, in the Nuremberg laws, for example, which is based on blood purity, and it's primitive and very bizarre. Interestingly, it is false science. Whereas again, citizenship through cosmopolitanism doesn't require a real reliance on any science except some kind of Newtonian calculation that every human being is equal to every other human being and is an axiomatic variable. That's reasonable, scientific reasoning, really related to physics, not to biology. In the case of race theory, purity of race, the idea of a tribe transmigrated from a historical concept based on common parentage, which could allow for the mixture of races. So membership, let's say in a tribe, doesn't require both parents, for example, to be descendants of the same tribe or have the same characteristics. So the tribal organization becomes a complex idea. I am not sure myself that we live in an age in which there are tribes. I've never thought about it. Never thought about myself as being a member of a tribe. And that is certainly the legacy of the reform movement in the 19th century of Judaism, of Haskalah, the creation of a reform movement, and the liberalization of conversion for those people who are religiously minded, which I'm not. But I'm not sure that we live in a world of tribes. The last thing I want to say is that what's interesting about the tribe is that it is also it's a flexible word that is inventable. So much of what we consider to be authenticity of tribes are made-up myths. Scottish clans, their symbols, they're a 19th century invention. And there is something archaic about the idea of tribe. And finally, also has the one important thing that the cosmopolitan lacks, which is the capacity to forge an emotional, irrational attachment to it. What is lacking in the cosmopolitan is the emotional plausibility of it, and therefore the accusation that it is overly abstract, whereas tribal membership, even more than racial purity, is something I can feel attached to. So in the German usage, a person who comes to the same place to eat or drink or in a hotel is a Stammgast. It's using the word in a new and different way. And the analogy to nature, which doesn't exist in the cosmopolitan. So I want to say thank you to the Hannah Arendt Center for forcing me to think about something I ordinarily would have never thought about. And because, in fact, English is not my first language, so the word tribe, for example, is, it's interesting in Hannah Arendt's case also to think about it, not that I think it's entirely revealing, but that the differences between the languages suggest ways of thinking about this question which are not evident in the English usage. I don't think the word Stamm, because of its multiple uses, has ever acquired the archaic character that the word tribe does in the English usage. I clearly am a fan of the political implications of the cosmopolitan, the acquisition of equal citizenship without reference to history and biology. And that explains Hannah Arendt's enormous attachment to the potential, not the reality, of American politics. So I want to welcome you again and thank Roger and his staff, all the members of staff, and I think it is my duty to introduce Joseph O'Neill, who is going, where is he? So I'm going to ask him to come forward, a colleague here on the faculty. And I think you're the moderator, is that right? Good, and he will take it from here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.